Chambliss is another important theorist, comparing or bringing together political economy and crime. Um, in Chambliss' view, everyone is deviant, so it's meaningless to ask why some are and some are not deviant. Ultimately, everybody's deviant. Chambliss was reviewing corrupt behavior and policies of the state, police, bureaucrats, politicians. These are some of the groups that we tend to give the benefit of the doubt to, especially police. We assume that they're just upholding the law and they don't break the law, but police are just like everybody else. They can be deviant as well. Now, Chambliss is more of a conflict theorist than he is a Marxist theorist, simply stating that he's expanding the definitions of power, and he's taking his theories outside of simple political economy. But he still adheres to many of the important aspects of Marxist theories. One is the content and operation of criminal law. He's concerned with that. He's concerned with the consequences of crime for society, and he's also focusing on the etiology of criminal behavior in and of itself. Some contemporary empirical studies have used the theory by arguing that the perceived threat of minority individuals, in many cases racial minorities, will increase the likelihood of social control on that group. Payne and Welch studied the discipline practices of 294 public schools, found that schools mirror get tough policies, even though there is a decline in delinquency. Once you start getting tough, it's really hard to pull that back, because people start to say, well, you're being too easy on this type of deviant behavior. So once you move down the get tough path, it's really hard to turn yourself around. And ultimately, they realized that schools in disadvantaged urban locations were with a disproportionate racial mix of students are way more likely to use punitive forms of discipline than they are restorative forms of discipline. Whereas you go out, this is like the urban city, you go out into the county and you see the opposite, where schools are more likely to use restorative forms of justice versus punitive forms of justice and discipline. Hagen is another important contemporary empirical theorist. They're arguing that, or Hagen argued that there's comparative nature to exploitation and social control in the disadvantaged, of course, Black and Latino groups compared to the white group. The disadvantaged groups are always going to compare themselves to the advantaged group. And they're also going to compare themselves to each other. And it's in the best interest of the advantaged group to keep that comparison between the disadvantaged groups than the disadvantaged groups understanding the connection between the two disadvantaged groups, and then focusing their attention on the advantaged group, in this case the white group, and how they're treated. Some criticisms of Marxism and conflict theory. Some argue that by dismissing social consensus, the theory ignores that some laws actually protect the interests of everyone. However, one could argue many laws don't protect the interests of everyone and are differentially enforced. So, yes, there are some laws that are designed to protect everyone, but that could be the outcome of a long struggle between the proletariat and the bourgeoisie. Take, for example, the passage of civil rights legislation in the 1960s. That legislation impacted was created to treat everyone equally. And in order to prevent the social organizational structure from falling apart, the elite had to make concessions to the mass and had to pass some laws that protected everyone. Another critique is it's more focused on theorizing than empirical inquiry. Some even say that if theories lack any evidence and are really nothing more than political statements, and that ultimately conflict theory does not identify how power is established. So these are some basic critiques of Marxism and conflict theory, but it doesn't change the fact that this is still a very salient and useful set of theories when you're trying to understand the creation of deviance and social inequality in a capitalist society. The two examples of deviance on the street and deviance in the suite are looking at shoplifting and lock-ins. The deviance in the street, of course, is looking at shoplifting and workplace, and is defined as larceny, theft by a person other than an employee. This would be considered street-level deviance and is relatively common. How this is policed is dependent on where you are and what your overall socioeconomic status is. If you're a relatively wealthy person from the dominant group, and you get caught shoplifting, you might experience some restorative disciplinary actions, much like we saw in many of the schools in the previous study. But if you're an African American kid in the inner city and you get caught shoplifting, you might have more of a punitive set of disciplinary actions. And then, of course, we take this into the suites and we talk about workplace lock-ins. This is where businesses, maybe at the end of the day or even during the workday, lock all the doors in the place to either prevent people that are working there as they during the shift from leaving, or preventing those that are there from shoplifting. They choose to go against the law, which is to make sure that there are accessible doors for people to get out of if and in case of an emergency. Essentially, employees are committing a deviant act in an attempt to reduce theft from employers are committing a deviant act in an attempt to reduce theft from employees, but at the same time, they're putting their employees in harm's way as well. And then the ideas in action, the concept of racial impact statements comes up in Chapter 9. Much like environmental impact statements or political impact statements, racial impact statements have existed since 2008 and have been set in place to help reduce racial discrepancies in the criminal justice system. This legislation extends the tenets of conflict theory and argues that various pieces of legislation have disproportionately impacted communities of color, and policies and legislation are created and maintained by the ruling class. So this ruling class really doesn't understand what it means to be a person of color living in an inner city neighborhood, yet they're creating policies that are going to impact those people that are living in places and experiencing lives that the ruling class just doesn't understand. So a racial impact statement given to a politician that is getting ready to vote on a crime bill it can be extremely important because it allows that politician who's getting ready to cast a vote in favor or not in favor of a particular piece of legislation to understand who the legislation is going to impact, how it's going to impact it, that population, why it's going to impact that population, and what does that mean over uh, the implication, what does that mean over the implementation of this new law if it's passed.